It was supposed to be the perfect weekend. The kind of trip you plan for months, where everything feels right, the weather's good, the company's better, and the air is crisp, fresh, the kind of forest scent that settles deep into your lungs. I remember waking up that morning with this almost childish excitement. The kind you get before an adventure, when everything's still light and easy. It was me, Mike, Sarah, Chris, and Katie, friends since high school. Mike, the loud one, always cracking jokes and pushing everyone to have fun. Sarah, the calm one, her laugh was the kind that made you feel like you belonged. Chris and Katie were the kind of couple that made you believe in love, constant affection, always touching, always laughing at inside jokes no one else understood. They were perfect together. We had decided on this remote part of the forest for our hiking trip. It was far enough from civilization that it felt secluded, but not so far that we couldn't make it in a day. The plan was simple: a day of hiking, a picnic by the creek, then an overnight stay under the stars. Nothing too ambitious, but that was the charm. No stress. Just us, the trees, and a few beers. By mid-afternoon, we'd set up camp near the creek, a place where the water babbled softly against the rocks. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. The air was warm, and the smell of pine and fresh earth hung thick in the air. Everything felt like it belonged in a postcard. The fire crackled, the sound of our laughter mingling with the occasional bird call. We passed around sandwiches, chips, and beers, talking about old memories and stupid stories from high school. Everything was so normal. So ridiculously, annoyingly normal. Then, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, the atmosphere shifted slightly. It wasn't much, just a weird kind of silence that settled around us, like the forest was holding its breath. The wind had died down, and suddenly, we could hear everything, the smallest noises, the rustling of leaves, the crackle of the fire. We joked about it, of course. Everyone laughed and tried to ignore the strange quiet, chalking it up to the fact that we were in the middle of nowhere. But even then, I could sense something, just a vague feeling, like the calm before a storm. That night, as we sat around the fire, there was this sense of unease in the air, something that none of us dared to vocalize. We kept our conversations light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We decided to go to bed early. The forest had turned cold, the kind of cold that settles deep into your bones, and the warmth of the fire wasn't enough to keep it at bay. As I crawled into my sleeping bag, I could hear Sarah and Mike talking in hushed tones, but the words were too muffled to make out. Chris and Katie were already asleep, their sleeping bags crumpled in a heap beside the fire, their faces peaceful in the flickering light. Then, just as I was starting to drift off, that's when it happened. It started as a faint noise, something I thought I'd imagined, a scream. It was far off, almost too far to hear clearly. But it wasn't like any scream I'd ever heard. It wasn't the scream of an animal, not the kind of thing you'd expect in the woods. It was human. And it wasn't just one scream. It was a series of them, followed by more, getting louder, closer. The air around us seemed to thicken, the hairs on my neck standing up. It wasn't just a noise. It was a sound filled with pain, with terror. We all sat up in an instant, our faces glowing in the firelight, the unease from earlier now replaced with a kind of primal fear. Katie was the first to speak, her voice shaking, barely audible. "What the hell is that?" she whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. I didn't have an answer, but the rest of the group could feel it too. The same gut-wrenching sense that something was horribly wrong. At first, we sat there, frozen in our sleeping bags, staring at each other in disbelief. No one spoke. The fire crackled, but it felt distant, almost like it didn't belong to us anymore. The screams continued, now louder, piercing the quiet of the forest. They sounded wrong. Like they were coming from deep within the woods, but also too close. They weren't the cries of someone in pain, they were desperate, guttural, filled with something dark. Mike was the first to move. He jumped out of his sleeping bag, fumbling for his flashlight. "I'm going to check it out," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "No." Sarah shot up, grabbing his arm, her fingers tight. "Mike, are you crazy?" "Maybe it's an animal," he said, but his voice wavered. It wasn't convincing. "Mike, no." Chris's voice was sharp now, a rare edge in it. "Stay here. We don't know what that is." The tension in the air thickened, each of us glancing nervously at the others. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a hiker. Maybe someone had gotten hurt and was calling for help. But as the screams continued, my mind wouldn't settle. The sounds grew more intense, the voices blending into each other, human and something else, something unnatural. I couldn't put my finger on it, but my gut twisted with dread. "We need to leave," I said, my voice shaky but firm. I didn't care if it was a hiker or a bear or whatever. The sounds were getting worse, almost like the forest itself was closing in on us. Katie nodded, her face pale, her lips trembling. "We need to go, now." And that's when it happened. A shadow darted through the trees just beyond our campfire's light. Too fast, too human-shaped, but wrong. It was more like a blur of motion, a twisted figure that shouldn't have been able to move that fast. "Did you see that?" Chris whispered, his voice low, barely audible, his face pale under the firelight. We all saw it. The movement had been too quick, too unnatural. Without another word, we grabbed our stuff, backpacks, sleeping bags, the scattered beer cans, and started to scramble. I wasn't even thinking anymore. The panic was taking over. The screams were louder now, closer, so close I could feel them in my chest. They didn't sound human anymore. They were twisted, animalistic, almost like they were coming for us. We were running blindly through the woods, our feet stumbling over the uneven ground, our breaths shallow, our hearts pounding. The trees around us seemed to close in, their dark trunks towering overhead, casting long, twisted shadows. It was cold now, the chill creeping up my spine as I tried to make sense of what was happening. And then, just as we were about to make it to the edge of the clearing, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind us. They were running, fast. Too fast. "Go!" I shouted, pushing Mike ahead of me, trying to shove the others forward, but no one was listening. Everyone was too caught up in their own terror. I turned, glancing over my shoulder, and that's when I saw them. People. At least, they looked like people, but something was off. They were running toward us, their movements erratic and jerky, as if they weren't quite human. They carried torches, the flames flickering wildly in their hands, casting eerie shadows that danced like ghosts across the trees. And the screams, they were coming from them. The sight of those figures, coming closer, screaming, their voices guttural and harsh, made my stomach lurch. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran deeper into the woods, my feet barely touching the ground as I crashed through the underbrush. I could hear my friends behind me, their breaths ragged, but I couldn't stop. The terror had taken over. I was running because I didn't know what else to do. The sounds of footsteps behind us weren't just in my head anymore. I could hear them clearly now, heavy, deliberate. They were chasing us. Not just running to get ahead, but hunting us. The thought hit me like a punch to the stomach. We were being hunted. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I ran, branches scraping my face, my legs screaming from the strain. The cold air burned my lungs, but I didn't care. All I could focus on was putting as much distance between me and those people, those things. We split up, not by choice but out of panic. I saw Mike veer left, disappearing into the trees, his flashlight bobbing in the dark. Sarah and Katie went the other way, running as fast as they could, their screams still echoing in the distance. "Chris!" I shouted, but there was no answer. I couldn't even see him anymore. I kept running, hoping someone, anyone, would make it out of this alive. But deep down, I knew the odds were against us. I ducked into a thicket, my heart pounding in my chest, every breath sharp and ragged. I crouched low, trying to control my breathing, trying not to make a sound. But the panic in my chest was a tidal wave, pushing me to look around, to keep moving, to do anything but stay still. But staying still was the only thing I could do now. I could hear the footsteps getting closer, the rustling of the leaves as they moved through the forest. They were searching. The torches flickered in the distance, casting ghostly light through the trees. The screams had died down, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. I couldn't tell if the others were still out there, if they were still alive, or if they'd been caught. Then, I heard it. A scream. A blood-curdling scream. It was Katie. I recognized her voice immediately. My stomach twisted with a sickening jolt. The sound was like nothing I'd ever heard, a raw, guttural cry that didn't stop, just stretched out into the air, disappearing into the dark. I could almost feel her terror, her helplessness. I couldn't even move, paralyzed by the horror of it. Then, nothing. Silence again. I felt like I was suffocating. What was happening to us? Why weren't they just running away like we were? Why were they hunting us? I tried to force my mind to focus on something, anything. I thought about the town, about the road I knew was nearby, somewhere to the south. I had to make it there. I had to. But before I could gather myself, I heard the footsteps again. They were closer this time, too close. I held my breath. My heart was hammering so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The brush around me felt suffocating, and I was almost certain I'd been found. And then, through the gap in the trees, I saw him. A figure. A man. No, not a man. He was too tall, his body too thin. He moved like something wasn't quite right, his legs jerking unnaturally with each step. I froze, my body refusing to move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't listen. The figure stopped, standing in the clearing just a few feet away from me. The torch in his hand flickered in the dark, casting long, twisted shadows on the trees. I could feel his gaze, even though I couldn't see his face. It was as if he knew exactly where I was, even in the darkness. I could almost hear his breathing, slow and deliberate. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, the space between us growing heavier and heavier, like something was pressing down on me from all sides. Then, a snap, a twig breaking underfoot from behind me. I whipped around, the sudden noise sending a wave of terror through me. I wasn't alone. Someone else was out there. The figure turned, hearing the sound too, and before I could even process what was happening, he was gone, disappearing back into the shadows. I didn't wait. I didn't think. I just ran that I didn't dare look back as I sprinted through the woods. The dark trees blurred around me, the branches scratching at my skin, the cold air ripping at my throat. My mind was a mess of panic and fear, my only thought to keep moving, keep running, don't stop, don't slow down. The sounds of pursuit were still there, just behind me. I could hear the rustling of leaves, the crunch of twigs underfoot, the shuffling of feet moving fast. But it wasn't just one person anymore. It was multiple, at least 3, maybe 4, maybe more. The forest around me felt alive with them, like it was closing in, shifting with their movements. I crashed through a thicket, the underbrush slapping at my face, but I didn't care. My chest burned with each breath, my legs aching, but I pushed on, adrenaline giving me the strength to ignore it. Then I heard something that froze me in place. A scream. It was Sarah. Her scream was sharp, desperate, and full of pain. It wasn't just the kind of scream you'd hear from someone who's scared, this was the kind of scream that came from a person who knew something horrible was coming, someone who had lost all hope. And then, as quickly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the screams, more suffocating. The kind of silence that wraps itself around you and chokes the air out of your lungs. I wanted to scream myself, to call out to her, to do something, but the reality hit me in waves. There was no saving anyone. I was alone now, and it wasn't over. I pushed forward, my eyes searching frantically for any sign of the road, any sign of safety. But the forest seemed endless. It felt like I'd been running for hours, but when I looked up, the trees were still the same, dark, thick, and suffocating. The further I ran, the more it felt like I was being drawn deeper into the nightmare. And then I heard it. The faintest whisper. A voice. It was too far away to be anyone I knew, too low to be distinct. But it was there. It was coming from behind me. The same voices I had heard earlier, the same twisted, guttural sounds that made my stomach churn. They were still searching for me. I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to think. But my body was giving out. I stumbled on a rock, falling to my knees, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I pushed myself back up, dizzy, disoriented, but I kept moving. And then, as I pushed through another row of trees, I saw it, a break in the forest. A clearing. I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if it was real, but I bolted for it, my legs screaming with exhaustion, my mind screaming with fear. I broke through the final line of trees, and there it was, a dirt road. It was faint, barely visible in the moonlight, but it was a road. A sign of civilization. I didn't know where it led. I didn't care. I just needed to get away. I didn't stop running until I saw it, a small house in the distance. It was a lonely, weathered place, a few lights flickering weakly in the windows. I wasn't sure who lived there, or if anyone was home, but I didn't hesitate. I ran straight for the house, my chest aching, my body on the verge of collapse. I pounded on the door, gasping for breath, my hands shaking as I knocked frantically. The door creaked open, and an elderly woman stood there, blinking in the dim light, her face puzzled. "Help," I managed to choke out. "Please, help me. They're chasing me." Before I could say another word, she took one look at me, wild-eyed, covered in dirt and blood, and slammed the door shut in my face. My heart sank. I pounded on the door again, shouting, pleading, but she didn't open it. I was on my own now. I had no choice but to keep moving. I followed the road, unsure of how far it would take me, unsure of anything. My mind was racing, my thoughts chaotic. The silence was deafening, and my body felt like it was about to give out at any second. Eventually, I stumbled across a police station on the outskirts of a small town. I don't remember much about the moment I arrived, only that I somehow managed to tell them what had happened. They listened. They took me in. They said the usual things, calming words, questions, but I could see it in their eyes. They didn't believe me. They didn't understand. It wasn't until they found the bodies. They found them a few days later, Mike, Chris, Sarah, Katie, all of them dead. Strangled, mutilated, unrecognizable. The police couldn't figure out who had done it. There were no signs, no clues, no traces of anyone else. It was like they just disappeared after the murders, like they had never existed. The investigation went nowhere. The news reports were all the same. Hiker deaths in local forest remain unsolved. But they didn't get it. They didn't understand. It wasn't just about the deaths. It wasn't just about what happened to us. It was about what I felt. To this day, I can't sleep without hearing their voices in my head. I can't close my eyes without seeing those figures chasing us through the woods, those torches flickering like a nightmare. I can't stop thinking about Sarah's scream. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I can still hear it, those voices, far off in the distance, calling me back to the forest. They're still out there. That I thought after all that happened, I'd be able to find some peace. I thought that once I got out of that forest, once I made it to the police station, the nightmare would end. But it didn't. In the weeks that followed, the terror only got worse. I tried to go back to normal life, went through the motions, forced myself to go to work, talk to friends, and pretend I wasn't haunted by the faces of my friends, the image of those people chasing us through the trees. But I couldn't shake it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the flashes of those torches in the dark, their twisted faces, the screams that still echoed in my head. I couldn't escape it. It wasn't just the dreams. It was everything. The shadows that moved just a little too quickly when I wasn't looking, the feeling of eyes on me when I walked alone at night. And the silence. The silence was the worst part. It was never truly silent anymore. I would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, hearing nothing but the whisper of the wind outside my window, and yet it felt as though the forest was still there, closing in around me. And the voices, those voices. They started to come back. Faint whispers, like they were just out of reach, like they were calling me, beckoning me back to the place I'd left behind. I could hear them in the dead of night, low and hollow, murmuring my name. I know it sounds insane. I know it sounds like I've lost it. But I haven't. I've been to the doctors. I've sat through therapy sessions. But nothing helps. It's like a part of me is still out there, still lost in that damn forest, and the souls of my friends, they're still with me. Their faces, their screams, they're all part of me now. It doesn't help that the police still have no answers. They've stopped looking. The investigation is closed. They don't even care anymore. The bodies were found, but there's no evidence, no leads, no suspects. Just dead ends. All they've left me with is a single, horrifying truth: I'm the only one who knows what happened. I can't go back to that place. I can't even bring myself to drive past the forest. I'm terrified it'll call me back, that I'll be pulled into it again, and this time, I won't make it out. I don't know who those people were, or what they wanted. I don't know why they killed my friends, or if they even really cared. But I can't shake the feeling that they're still out there. I can feel it every time I look over my shoulder, every time I walk alone in the dark. I know the truth, and it's something I can't escape. My friends are gone. They died in that forest, and their spirits, they're not at rest. They're waiting for me. Sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I hear their voices calling to me. Whispering my name, urging me to return. And when that happens, I lie awake, terrified that one day I won't be able to resist. I've heard stories about haunted places, about cursed lands, about spirits that won't let go. But I never believed in them. Not until now. Now, I live with it every day. The fear, the guilt, the feeling that they're still with me. And I know, no matter how hard I try to forget, that I will never escape them. Months have passed since that night in the forest, and I still can't escape what happened. The nightmares haven't stopped. In fact, they've gotten worse. Every time I close my eyes, I see my friends' faces, twisted in terror, lost in the dark. Every time I wake up, I hear the sounds of those hunters, their footsteps chasing me through the trees. I know the police don't care anymore. They never found answers, never found the killers. They probably think I made it all up, that I've lost my mind from trauma, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. I can still feel the cold grip of fear when I think about that forest. The forest that won't let me go. I try to tell myself it's over, that I survived, that I'm out of it. But something is off. Something always feels wrong. The whispers I hear when I'm alone, they don't stop. Sometimes I catch myself staring out the window, waiting for them to come for me. I tell myself it's just my mind, that it's just the anxiety, but deep down, I know they're still there. Still watching. I heard something once, from an old man at the local diner. He told me the forest has a curse, a history of disappearances, of people who wandered in and never came back. He said it's always been that way, that it draws people in and won't let them leave. I thought he was crazy at first. But after everything, I wonder if he was right. I wondered if what happened to me was more than just a random tragedy. I've never been able to forget it, the silence after the screams, the way everything just went dark, like the life had been sucked out of the world. The way I felt like I wasn't alone, even in the quietest moments. I tried to go back once. Not to the exact spot, but to the edge of the forest, just to see if I could find something, anything, that would give me closure. I stood there, in the same spot where we had parked the car, where we laughed and joked before everything fell apart. I didn't find anything. The forest was still as cold, still as silent, still as hungry as it had been before. I walked away, but the feeling stayed with me. The feeling that it was waiting for me to come back, that it wasn't finished with me yet. I don't know how much longer I can take this. Every day, I feel like I'm one step closer to losing it completely. I hear things in the night that aren't there. I see things moving in the shadows. It's like the forest has somehow become a part of me, and there's no escaping it. I'll never be the same again. And I know I'll never forget. Those faces, those screams, those sounds, they'll haunt me for the rest of my life. And every time the wind picks up, I can't help but wonder if they're calling me back, waiting for me to return. But I won't go. I can't. The forest won.